Okay then, so this is for History Alexander II. This is for lesson 3 and 4 this week. So for one group it's Tuesday's lesson, which we already did, and then it's Thursday afternoon, which we didn't do. And for the other class it's the lesson that they should be having at this very moment, in fact, or almost anyway. It's lesson 3 and 4. So for the class which I had on Tuesday, if you were in, you can kind of tune out, zone out, pause late for the first couple of minutes, and then zone back in again, I suppose. Right, so what the second lesson is really about is it's the process of how. So the previous lesson was about why he did the reform, consequence of Crimea, economic reasons, moral reasons, etc., etc. We now move on to the nuts and bolts of actually how he did it. And essentially what we did, there's a great big, well, not that long actually, there's a PowerPoint which kind of goes through the nuts and bolts of it. I'm not going to read it through because you can read it through yourself. And there's a page in your booklet, looks like that, with the title, How Did Alexander Liberate the Serfs? And what you need to do is basically look at the PowerPoint and fill it in. So it starts off about how he has some grand committee chaired by Prince Orlov, or Duke, whatever his name was. He then has what were the key principles, and then what were the 3 stages of implementation. What you'll notice from the principles, it says that serfdom must be abolished was a principle. The peasants must be able to buy the land. The Tsar was quite worried about having lots of landless peasants. I mean, what would they do if they had no land? It was going to cause trouble. So he was keen that they should be able to buy land. The stuff about redemptive payments for 49 years. So this idea that they basically have to pay compensation to their landowners, because obviously they're a valuable asset for their landowners. So in order to be free, the next 49 years they have to pay, I don't know how much it was, they have to pay a certain amount of money for the privilege of being freed, basically. It's like an economic compensation for the landlords. And then there's a labour service and all the other bits and bobs. So you need to fill that in. It shouldn't take you too long. When you've done that, on the next page of the booklet, there's a table with the heading, Who benefited the most from the emancipation? And it has the Tsarist regime, the nobility, and the peasants. And what you've got to do is basically got to use your family brain cell from that PowerPoint and think, well, in what way did the Tsarist regime benefit? How did the nobility perhaps benefit? How did the peasants benefit from the system? And then think about how, if it's applicable, these groups did not benefit from the emancipation. So what I'll do, I'll give you a couple of minutes. I want you to pause this in a minute or two, do that in, and then I'll have a quick chat about what the answers are, basically, and then we'll go on to the next little bit. So press pause, do that bit, and then come back. Okay then, so you should hopefully have filled that in. So just to go through some of the key points there. So ways in which the Tsarist regime failed is quite obvious. The Tsar system continued. The number of disturbances went down as well post emancipation. So again, in that respect, the Tsarist regime succeeded. Ways in which they failed to benefit. Well, to be honest with you, the next task might help you a little bit more. One of the sources you're going to use for the consequence of emancipation does suggest actually it helped to weaken the Tsarist regime. It didn't quite lead to 1917 revolution, but basically a lot of the landowners became a lot poorer as a consequence of emancipation, and it weakened their kind of blind loyalty to the Tsar, essentially. So I suppose that fits into not benefiting for the Tsarist regime and the nobility. The way in which the nobility benefited, obviously, was that they got these redemptive payments and stuff, and they still maintained their serfs for 2 years until the process of the land, etc., etc. How did the peasants benefit? Well, again, if you think about it, they gained their freedom, they were able to marry who they liked, they could go where they liked. Ways in which they failed to benefit, again, if you think about it, they had to pay redemptive payments. They were often given the worst land, and often for high prices as well by the landowners. So The next test we're going to do about the consequences, we'll probably give you a bit more detail for this table. It's one of those, where do I put this little bit from? So you've got to add more onto it when you've done the next task. But it does seem clear that all three groups benefited to some extent, and the nobility perhaps benefited the least because obviously they lost their serfs. Okay, speaking of the next task, what I then want you to do is, there's a page called in the booklet, How Far Were the Landowners Appeased by the Emancipation of the Serfs? By appeased, what I mean is, how were their interests kind of looked after by the emancipation? How did the Tsar try to keep them on track? It started with a little bit of a speech by Alexander II, which he made to the Council of State in 1861. Okay, the Council of State's kind of this grand kind of committee of nobility. There's a couple of questions based on that, which I think are fairly common sense. Why did Alexander fear that failure to enact emancipation would be disastrous? How did the emancipation benefit the nobility? What did the Tsar mean by the final sentence? So I think that should be fairly straightforward. Again, any problems, let me know. The big task I was going to make you all do, if we've been in lesson, was I've got these laminated cards. I call them evidence cards. There's about 13 of them or something. And what I was going to make you do is wander around the classroom, and then you have to kind of write down from these sources what were the consequences of emancipation. Some negative, some positive, just depends. What I'm going to do instead, I'm going to send them out to you, and what I want you to do is to read them through and then complete you've got a page which says what were the consequences of the emancipation, when it says consequences in the middle, and I suggest you do some kind of spider diagram. This was my spider diagram which I did. What I've done, you can see I put numbers by them, so that's where the source is. So like source 13 says this thing here, and source 11 says that, or whatever. That's the way I did it. Okay, and you should have on here as a consequence, it's about consequences, lots of consequences of the emancipation. So what I want you to do is to press pause, do what I've asked you to do, and I'll send out the email when this video is uploaded. I might want a cup of tea first, but I'll send it up when it's uploaded. And then a couple of minutes, then when you've done that, then press play, and I'll have a little chat about these consequences. Okay then, so if you've done those consequences, if you look at them, there are a number of consequences of the emancipation, some good and some bad, depending on who you are. I won't go through all of them. I think quite a few of them kind of make sense. So you've got things like from source 4, it enabled military reform to take place. You've got like from source 3, it talks about how the peasants were given the worst land for the highest prices. I mean, it's quite clever. If you're a nobleman, you're not going to give your prize land dead cheap, are you, to some snotty-nosed peasants? You're going to give them the bit of land where it's a bit boggy and stuff, and see how much money you can get out of them, essentially. So they're saying the peasants didn't benefit because they got the worst land. The redemptive payments were a burden. They had to pay for 49 years. So that was a problem for the peasants. However, source 8 suggests or says that the peasant disturbances actually went down. So source 3 is kind of saying how bad things were for the peasants, the worst land and stuff. But then source 8 says the number of disturbances they had actually went down, which might suggest that they weren't that unhappy. I don't know. What else have we got here? We've got this is interesting. Source 13, I think, is quite interesting. It talks about how serfs were clearly able to move a lot more. Because it says internal passports to citizens increased rapidly after 1860. So basically, before the emancipation, if you wanted to move from one bit of Russia to another, so you wanted to leave Nuneatonski and go to Bedouinski, you had to get like an internal passport to give permission to move from one bit to another. After 1860, they still had the internal passports, but lots more were given out, which suggests that peasants were moving around a lot more. It also suggests there was some evidence of specialisation taking place in farming. So now peasants had their own land, they begin to experiment a bit more, looking at new technology. Again, how many peasants this would be, it doesn't really say. I suspect for the vast majority of peasants, the still farming to survive. But as we'll discover later on, there were some peasants who actually, I want to say wealthier peasants, want for a better word, who actually bought up a bit more land and were able to become slightly more wealthy kind of agricultural workers. Source 13 also says that food production was quite modest. So again, these changes did not result in massive amounts of more food, which suggests that the amount of specialisation and stuff was actually fairly limited. It's also got other things on here. Source 9, this is the one I mentioned before, a big decline in land ownership by the nobility. So it suggests, and again source 11 as well, precipitated the decline of the landed gentry. 2/3 of serfs mortgaged to pay debt from a third of estates. 40% of gentry land was sold off. So what these two sources are suggesting is that one consequence of emancipation was actually the landowners who've been living they've got into huge debt trying to, I think they're all fancy people like in the West. The budget just been spend. The amount of money they were getting was going down and down, and now they kind of had to free their free labour. They got themselves into even bigger financial pickle, for want of a technical word. And so what you saw was that they were beginning to sell off some of their estates, which did allow some, and again it's a very small sum, I'll say it in strong terms, where it did allow some peasants to buy more land and become slightly wealthier peasants, but it did begin this decline. And again, as I suggested earlier on, it did open some cracks up between the Tsar and the nobility, because obviously they were his big supporters, the nobility, but now they're kind of they've been disadvantaged by one of his reforms, despite Alexander's best attempts to keep them on side with things like redemptive payments and stuff. There's some other bits and bobs as well in here. So you've got the Zemstva. This is about local government. We'll do these next week. They almost became like a focus for more radical change in Russia, as we'll come across later on. But you also got this thing like in source 1 where it talks about the Mir keen to keep subsistence farming. The Mir basically, they're like village elders, and they're basically, their job was to kind of run the village, so to speak. So I imagine really old men with great big long white beards. They're probably not, but that's how I imagine them. And they're kind of quite conservative with a small c, arguably. And so you might go to them and say, oh, I've got this new idea, and you had to get permission from this little group of elders to do what you wanted. And they say, oh, no, you can't do that. We've always done it this way ever since Peter the Great, blah, 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 blah. And again, source 1 suggesting that these people kind of kept the peasants in line. So there's some of the consequences. And perhaps you want to have a think about what some of the major consequences here, what some of the big consequences, and again, use this knowledge from these consequences to add to that table you did earlier on, talking about which group benefited or didn't benefit. Okay, so that should cover you for that. Get my file back in order. Yeah, so that's essentially what you need to do, because next lesson we'll look at these interpretations and how we go about doing interpretations, and then we'll move on to other reforms which Alexander made. One thing I forgot to go over, and I forgot to really mention, so some of you may or may not have done this, there is a page early on some of Alexander's key ministers or advisors, Grand Duke Constantine, Malutin, etc., etc. If you make sure you get that done as well for next week, what I'll probably do it on Monday, I think. I'll basically have a little chat about those advisors, and then I'll have a little chat to you all about how we do the interpretation type of questions in preparation for the exam, and then we'll move on to the consequences, or sorry, not consequences, some of the other reforms which Alexander made. Okay, so if you get all that done, have a nice weekend. Feel free to email me in college hours if you're unsure about something or whatever. It doesn't look very sunny today, so I'll probably be inside most of the day. If you haven't sent me those source answer yet, I'm going to send an email when I've uploaded this anyway. If you haven't done it yet, then please do it ASAP, because I wouldn't mind having a look at them over the weekend. Then I can get back to you about them, and then need to tip-tap another one up for you all. Okay, have a nice weekend.